All right, so get ready for this deep dive. It's going to get us thinking about how we think about death and dying.
Yeah, definitely not your typical light conversation.
Right. But it's important stuff, and today we're going deep into a TED Talk by Dr. B.J. Miller.
He's a hospice and palliative medicine physician.
And he brings this really unique perspective.
Like a mix of personal experience and professional expertise.
Yeah, and he kicks things off with this incredible story about being in college and, climbing on top of a parked train.
Oh, I've heard about this.
Yeah, and he gets hit with 11,000 volts of electricity.
Oh my gosh.
I know, it's unbelievable, right? He actually survived that.
Wow.
And the detail that just stuck with me is he talks about how his watch was still working after the shock, and his father wears it now.
It's like this powerful symbol of, the things that endure even after something so traumatic.
Absolutely. It makes you think about life and death and the connections that remain. And that accident, as tragic as it was, it actually led him to this whole field of hospice and palliative medicine.
Right, like he found his calling through that experience.
And that comes through so strongly in his whole approach to caregiving. He talks about this idea of necessary suffering versus unnecessary suffering.
Yeah, that's a key distinction, right?
Okay, so necessary suffering, help me out here.
Well, think of it like this. It's the suffering that's just part of life.
Yeah.
We can't avoid it.
Like loss, grief, physical pain, things like that.
Exactly. It's like growing pains. We learn and grow from them, but then there's unnecessary suffering.
And that's the stuff we can actually do something about.
Exactly. That's where we can make a real difference.
So what are some examples of unnecessary suffering?
Well, think about systems that dehumanize people or, medical practices that focus only on the disease, not the person as a whole.
Like when you're just a number in the system.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And Dr. Miller argues that we can and should actively work to change that kind of suffering.
So it's not about pretending that life is perfect or painless.
No, not at all.
But recognizing there are things we can control.
Right. It's about minimizing the suffering that doesn't need to be there.
Okay, that makes sense. And he gives this powerful example to illustrate this point.
Oh, yeah. The story about Frank.
Yeah, Frank was living with both prostate cancer and HIV.
Right. A tough situation to be in.
And you'd think someone in that situation might be extra cautious,
Yeah. Play it safe.
But Frank decides to go whitewater rafting down the Colorado River.
That's not exactly playing it safe.
I know, right? Sounds pretty risky to me.
But for Frank, that adventure was a way to really live life on his own terms.
To embrace what mattered most to him, even with the risks.
And Dr. Miller supported him in that decision.
Which I think is so important,
Yeah.
Sometimes we need someone to say, hey, it's okay to take a chance, even if it's scary.
It's about quality of life, not just extending life no matter what.
So recognizing what truly matters to each person, even when they're facing a serious illness.
Exactly. And, this reminds me of how Dr. Miller actually studied art history after his accident. He wanted to learn how to see differently.
Like shift his perspective.
Exactly. And I think that's what he's asked us to do with end-of-life care, too.
Look at it from a different angle. Find the beauty and meaning that might be hidden beneath the surface.
Right. And this leads us to how he contrasts the typical hospital experience with the approach at the Zen Hospice project where he works.
Okay, so we've all probably had some experience with hospitals, either personally or through loved ones.
And they're essential for acute care, for sure.
But they don't always feel like the most human places.
Right. You get that sense that it's all about procedures and machines, not really about the human experience.
Exactly. And Dr. Miller describes this beautiful ritual they have at the Zen Hospice. When someone passes away, they actually wheel the person's body through the garden.
I've heard about this. It's amazing.
They pause for songs or stories, maybe even just silence, and they sprinkle flower petals.
It's about honoring the person's life and spirit, creating a sense of peace and dignity.
And that's such a contrast to how death is often handled in hospitals. It feels so much more humane.
Right. And Dr. Miller shares this really touching story from his own experience in the hospital. He was in the burn unit recovering from his injuries, and a nurse smuggled in a snowball for him.
Wait, a snowball?
Yeah, snowball. It might seem like a small thing, but to him, it was this moment of pure joy, like a reminder that even in a sterile, painful environment, there can still be beauty and kindness.
And that human connection, that human touch.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder what else we could be doing to bring that kind of beauty and dignity into end-of-life care.
Like, how can we make it more human?
Right. And that's precisely where Dr. Miller's next big idea comes in, the idea of designing for dignity and well-being.
Okay, so not just minimizing suffering, but actually making life more wonderful.
You got it. And that's where this idea of play comes in.
Okay, I'm going to need you to explain this one, because play and death and dying don't seem to go together.
I know it sounds strange, right? But hear me out.
All right, I'm listening.
Dr. Miller argues that play is actually one of our highest forms of adaptation
Yeah.
as humans. Think about it. We took the need for food and created cuisine.
Starting to see where you're going with this.
We took the need for shelter and created architecture. We took the need for clothing and created fashion.
So we took basic needs and transformed them into art forms.
Exactly. And he suggests we can apply that same creative energy to the experience of dying.
Not to make light of it, but to make the process more meaningful, more human, even more beautiful.
Exactly. And he gives some really interesting examples from the Zen Hospice. He talks about this woman named Jeanette who had ALS and decided to start smoking again.
Smoking! But wasn't she really sick?
Yeah, but it wasn't about being reckless. It was about wanting to feel her lungs fill while she still could. It was about reclaiming a sense of agency and pleasure.
It's like she was making a choice, not just letting the illness dictate her experience.
Exactly. And then there's Kate, who found more comfort in cuddling with her dog than in going through another round of chemo.
So recognizing that their priorities might shift and what brings them comfort might not be what we expect.
It's about honoring those individual choices and recognizing that sometimes the most meaningful experiences are the simple ones. A familiar smell, a warm touch, a moment of connection.
It's those little things that make us feel human.
Right. And that brings us to another fascinating aspect of the Zen Hospice, the kitchen.
The kitchen. But I thought you said a lot of the residents couldn't eat anymore.
That's true. Many can't. But the kitchen is still the heart of the hospice.
Okay, so what do they do there?
They bake cookies there, not necessarily to nourish the body, but to stimulate the senses, to create a sense of warmth and familiarity.
So it's more about the experience than the actual eating.
And that brings us to a really crucial point about Dr. Miller's approach to caregiving, especially for those with dementia. He emphasizes the importance of tending to the senses and the body, even when the mind might be fading. It's about connecting with what makes us feel human, even as our bodies are failing.
This has been so insightful already, but I feel like we've just scratched the surface of Dr. Miller's ideas.
We have a lot more to unpack, for sure.
Can we recap what we've covered so far?
Absolutely. Dr. Miller's given us a lot to think about, and he's laid out 3 design cues for redesigning the end-of-life experience. The first is understanding the difference between necessary and unnecessary suffering.
Right, acknowledging that we can't avoid all suffering, but we can work to alleviate the kind that's caused by our systems and practices.
The second is tending to dignity through the senses and the body, creating environments and experiences that are comforting, meaningful, even beautiful.
And the third design cue
is to shift our focus to well-being, finding ways to make life more wonderful, not just less horrible.
So it's not about denying the reality of death, but about bringing more life, more humanity into the experience.
Exactly. And this leads us to a really profound question that Dr. Miller poses. Toward the end of his talk, he asks, if dying is a necessary part of life, what will you create with this fact? How can you bring more beauty and meaning into the time you have left?
Wow. That's a heavy question, but I feel like we need some time to really unpack it. Let's explore that more in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, it really gets you thinking, right? Like, what do I want my life to be about?
It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day stuff and forget about the bigger picture.
He's reminding us that we all have a limited amount of time.
And how we choose to spend that time really matters.
And he's not just talking about individuals here. He's calling for a societal shift in how we approach end-of-life care.
So he's talking about policy changes and stuff like that.
Yeah, he wants to see a system that supports people in living well, even as they're dying.
Okay, so like better training for healthcare professionals.
More resources for families, creating environments that truly feel like homes, not just hospitals.
It's a big vision, right? It makes you wonder if it's actually possible.
It is a tall order, but I think his optimism comes from the fact that we already know what matters most to people at the end of life.
So what does the research show?
Well, it shows it's about feeling comfortable, unburdened, finding peace, experiencing a sense of wonder and connection, those kinds of things.
Those are pretty universal desires.
Exactly. We have the knowledge now, we just need to put it into practice.
Okay, so that's the big picture stuff. But what about us? We're not doctors or policymakers, so how can we as everyday people bring these ideas into our own lives and relationships?
Well, I think it starts with awareness.
Like being more conscious of our own mortality.
Exactly.
That's not always easy to do.
No, it's not. But Dr. Miller encourages us to accept death as a natural part of life.
And by doing so, maybe we can start to shift our priorities to focus on what truly matters to us.
To appreciate the small things, the moments of connection and beauty that we often overlook in our busy lives.
It's so easy to get caught up in the hustle and bustle and forget to just be present.
He's really asking us to slow down and savor what we have.
And be more present for the people in our lives.
Yes, listen to them deeply. Offer them your presence and compassion.
It makes me think about how we often try to avoid uncomfortable emotions like sadness or grief.
We want to push them away, pretend they're not there.
But Dr. Miller seems to be saying that those emotions are a part of life too.
And that we can actually learn from them, grow from them.
So it's not about trying to fix everything or make it all better.
Sometimes the most helpful thing you can do is just be there with someone without judgment.
Just holding space for them.
Exactly. And by embracing our own vulnerability, we can become more compassionate toward others who are facing difficult times.
It's like we're all in this together, right? Life and death, joy and sorrow, it's all part of the human experience.
Beautifully said. And, even though Dr. Miller didn't specifically talk about joy in his talk, I think it's woven throughout his message.
How so?
If we can embrace life fully with all its complexities and challenges, then joy naturally arises.
Not as this constant state of happiness, but as a deeper appreciation for the preciousness of each moment.
Exactly. And ultimately, I think that's what Dr. Miller is trying to do with his work. He's trying to help us all live more fully, more authentically, more meaningfully.
He's asking us to consider what we want to create with the time we have left.
It's a question that can guide our decisions, our relationships, our creative endeavors.
And it's a question we'll continue to explore in the next part of our deep dive. Okay, so we've been really diving deep into Dr. Miller's ideas about how we approach end-of-life care, but also just, how we live our lives.
Yeah, it's all connected, right?
And it keeps coming back to that question he asks about what we'll create with the time we have left.
Such a powerful way to frame it,
It is. Instead of focusing on the fear of death, he turns it into this opportunity to really make the most of our lives.
And it's not about these grand gestures either.
Right. It's about the everyday
The
moments.
small choices that add up over time.
It reminds me of how we talked about play. You remember that?
Oh, yeah. At first, I was like, play. We're talking about death here.
I know, me too. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense.
It's about bringing that spirit of curiosity and delight into everything we do.
Like, even when things are tough, can we still find those moments of joy?
Exactly. And can we allow ourselves to be surprised by those moments?
Like Jeanette choosing to smoke again?
Right. Or Kate finding comfort in her dog.
These stories show that there's no one right way to approach these things.
What brings one person peace might not work for another.
And it all comes down to trusting people to make their own choices.
Even if those choices seem unconventional.
Which is something we don't always do well as a society.
We have all these ideas about how things should be, especially around aging and dying.
But Dr. Miller is really challenging us to rethink those assumptions.
To go beyond just minimizing suffering and focus on creating more well-being.
Like that ritual at the Zen Hospice with the flower petals.
That's beautiful, right?
It's about making death more meaningful.
And I think that's a key takeaway from Dr. Miller's whole approach.
It's not about denying the reality of death, but about finding ways to live more fully, even as we're facing our own mortality.
And I think that's where this deep dive comes full circle.
It's not just about end-of-life care. It's about how we approach life itself.
Are we going to live in fear, or are we going to embrace each day with open hearts?
Knowing that our time is precious, but not letting that paralyze us.
Using that knowledge to fuel our creativity, our connections, our presence in each moment.
Because ultimately, that's what Dr. Miller is inviting us to do.
To create something beautiful and meaningful with the time we have.
However long or short that may be.
And that's a challenge and an invitation that we can all carry with us.
So we encourage you to keep thinking about these ideas, talk about them with your loved ones, and keep seeking out those moments of beauty, connection, and joy that make life so incredibly worthwhile. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.